Hey everybody, welcome to my channel. Like, subscribe, thumbs up, comment, all that good stuff. And let's jump into the video. Was Sega really better at sports games than Nintendo? I know Sega gets the reputation, especially during the Genesis era, of having been all about sports games. I remember the magazines talking about it all the time. Sega was, if you were a sports fan, you bought a Genesis. If you weren't, you bought a Super Nintendo. Well, it was way more complicated than that. But the general consensus was, at the time, people believed Sega was where it was at in terms of sports games. Now, am I going to say sports games in general just flat out suck? They're not even worth our time. Why are we talking about them? Well, I could, but I won't. Because that's not fair. Also, you can't talk about Sega Sports without mentioning EA. Because Sega's first sports video game was literally a ROM hack of an EA game. It was a reskin of Madden NFL Football. Yes, Joe Montana Sports Talk Football is literally just a graphic reskin of John Madden NFL Football on the Sega Genesis. We all got duped. We were stupid and fell for it. Shit happens, what are you going to do about it? You grow up, you get over it. That being said, the two games were on sale side by side, and people do remember Joe Montana Sports Talk Football on Sega Genesis, and I believe there may have been a Sega CD version. I'm not 100%, so don't quote me on this. But it's still Madden NFL Football, and obviously Madden is still getting made today, and nobody even remembers who the fuck Joe Montana... I even said John Montana. Joe Montana is. Can't even get his name right. They certainly don't remember the game. And if you're collecting for the Sega Genesis, yeah, you're going to buy Joe Montana before you buy Madden. But if you're a modern gamer that's collecting for the Genesis and you're coming at it from today's perspective, you're going to go for Madden first because that's the game you know. Now, Sega did a lot of racing games, arcade-style racing games, which they were really, really good at. But racing games aren't technically sports games. I know Daytona, F1, etc. kind of, sort of, almost are, but we're going to brush that aside. That's a separate category. Yeah, I will say 1,000% they're better at racing games than Nintendo. Nintendo's got two. Mario Kart, which they've made a bajillion times, and F-Zero, which they neglect for some ungodly reason. Which, by the way, the best F-Zero that has ever graced a Nintendo console was made by Sega. So yeah, Sega does racing games better than Nintendo. And if you don't agree with that, you're wrong. I'm not saying Mario Kart's not a great game. It's just the only racing game Nintendo can do. Whereas Sega does some really fantastic racing games. Sega Rally, Daytona USA, Virtua Racing, the list goes on. Sega's better at racing games than Nintendo. That I can say definitively. Sports games, I'm not convinced. Yes, they had some good simulation sports games on the Genesis that were made by and or published by Sega. Again, we don't know how many of them were just reskins of EA sports games. We do know that Joe Montana was, but beyond that, who gives a shit? Right? I don't know. But they did the standard assortment. They had basketball games. They had football games. They had college sports games. They were, and I will say this, really good at NHL hockey and baseball games. Their World Series baseball is probably the only good 16-bit, 32-bit era baseball game. I will say that. But I'm going to backpedal that a little bit and say maybe not the only good one, but probably the best one. Because Nintendo had Ken Griffey Jr. Baseball, which was actually a legit good game. But Nintendo also had Pro Action Football, which was a better football game than people remember it as. And Nintendo also had a handful of additional sports games. I'm not going to sit here and list them all. Now, when you look at what they did, Sega, when they were making sports games, just like EA, they were making sports simulations. Which was very rare for Nintendo, when they did make a sports title, whatever it was, they were making arcade-style action sports games. Now, eventually, Nintendo would just basically slap Mario characters in every sports game that they made from eternity till to the end of time. So nowadays, if it doesn't have Mii characters, it's got Mario characters in it. But Nintendo is still to this day making sports games, and Sega is not doing this anymore because they sold off their sports division when the Dreamcast flopped. But we're not talking about that. We're not talking about today. We're just talking about the 8-bit, 16-bit, and 32-bit era. And when I say 32-bit era, I'm lumping the N64 in there because it came out around the same time. But anyways, the Bit Wars is what we're referring to. During the Bit Wars, the perception was Sega did sports better. But I don't know if this is fair or accurate. Because if you look at the third-party offerings, you had the same games on both systems. EA games were on both systems. You had whatever EA was doing on the Genesis, they had the same game on the SNES. And it was the same game. There was console parity. If it had a feature on the Genesis, it had the same feature on the SNES. One version might have ran a little smoother and had less lag. The other version had more colors and slightly better graphics in some cases. But they were the same game, more or less. The differentiator was Sega's first-party sports games and Nintendo's first-party sports games. Which, again, I've already mentioned King Griffey Jr. They also had some basketball games, and they had a few other sports games. Like I said, Pro Action Football. And they had some... they had the boxing games, you know, they had the Punch-Out. I forgot what it was called. They had the Punch-Out series, which were popular. The closest thing Sega had to that, they had some boxing games on the Genesis, but the closest thing to a Punch-Out they had was Tough Man Contest on the 32X, which you didn't play, I didn't play, nobody played. Nobody owned a 32X, and if you did, you weren't playing Tough Man Contest. Be honest. Stop lying, you sack of shit. Now, if you add the Sega CD, and you look at the sports games that were on the Sega CD that Sega did, the ESPN series, yeah, you've got some top-notch games, I'll admit. Even I played them, because the Sega CD sports games was probably some of the best games on the Sega CD. And then you've also got, you know, other popular sports games that weren't made by Sega, like, Quarterback Club and stuff like that, NBA Jam, etc., which again were on multi-platform, were on every other system. So again, those weren't exclusive to Sega. So I guess it comes down to, what are you looking for? Are you looking for a sports simulation? Well, yeah, you're going to get that from Sega, but you're also going to get the exact same game from EA, and you can play that game on the Super Nintendo. You don't have to have a Genesis to play that game. You don't. If you prefer arcade-style action sports games, then you're going to go for Nintendo, because that's what they produced. You still had some arcade-style sports games on the Genesis, you know, the Mutant League games, NBA Jam, stuff like that. You know, so they were still on the Genesis, yeah, sure. But they were more notable on the NES and the SNES. You know, Double Dribble, Tecmo Bowl, Super Tecmo Bowl, etc. Those were known for being Nintendo games, even if they weren't technically made by Nintendo. They were on the Nintendo console. I'm going to say no. Sega was not better at sports games than Nintendo. They just took a different approach. It's going to really come down to what you're looking for. But if what you're looking for is just a ROM hack of EA's game, that's not better than Nintendo creating a wholly original game. Is it? Be honest.